Remittances and human capital. Even in an era of international investments in the trillions of dollars, other kinds of transfers of wealth among nations remains significant. These include remittances, foreign aid, and transfers of human capital in the form of the skills and entrepreneurship of emigrants. Remittances. Emigrants working in foreign countries often send money back to their families to support them. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, Italian emigrant men were particularly noted for enduring terrible living conditions in various countries around the world and even skimping on food in order to send money back to their families in Italy. Most of the people fleeing the famine in Ireland during the 1840s traveled across the Atlantic with their fares paid by remittances from members of their families already living in the United States. The same would be true of Jewish emigrants from Eastern Europe to the United States in later years. In the 21st century, remittances are among the main sources of outside money flowing into poorer countries. In 2009, for example, the worldwide remittances to these countries were more than 2.5 times the value of all foreign aid. At one time, overseas Chinese living in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian nations were noted for sending money back to their families in China. Politicians and journalists in these countries often whipped up hostility against the overseas Chinese by claiming that such remittances were impoverishing the host countries for the benefit of China. In reality, the Chinese created many of the enterprises, and sometimes whole industries, in these Southeast Asian nations. What they were sending back to China was a fraction of the wealth they had created and added to the wealth of the countries where they were now living. Similar charges were made against the Lebanese in West Africa, the Indians and Pakistanis in East Africa, and other groups around the world. The underlying fallacy in each case was due to ignoring the wealth created by these groups, so that the countries to which they immigrated had more wealth, not less, as a result of these groups being there. Sometimes the hostility generated against such groups has led to their leaving these countries or being expelled, often followed by economic declines in the countries they left. Emigrants and immigrants. People are one of the biggest sources of wealth. Whole industries have been created and economies have been transformed by immigrants. Historically, it has not been at all unusual for a particular ethnic or immigrant group to create or dominate a whole industry. German immigrants created the leading beer breweries in the United States in the 19th century, and most of the leading brands of American beer in the 21st century are still produced in breweries created by people of German ancestry. China's most famous beer, Tsingtao, was also created by Germans, and there are German breweries in Australia, Brazil, and Argentina. There were no watches manufactured in London until Huguenots fleeing France took watchmaking skills with them to England and Switzerland, making both these nations among the leading watchmakers in the world. Conversely, France faced increased competition in a number of industries which it had once dominated because the Huguenots, who had fled persecution in France, created competing businesses in surrounding countries. Among the vital sources of the skills and entrepreneurship behind the rise of first Britain and later the United States to the position of the leading industrial and commercial nation in the world were the numerous immigrant groups who settled in these countries, often to escape persecution or destitution in their native lands. The woolen, linen, cotton, silk, paper, and glass industries were revolutionized by foreign workers and foreign entrepreneurs in England, while the Jews and the Lombards developed British financial institutions. The United States, as a country populated overwhelmingly by immigrants, had even more occupations and industries created or dominated by particular immigrant groups. The first pianos built in colonial America were built by Germans, who also pioneered in building pianos in Tsarist Russia, England, and France. And firms created by Germans continued to produce the leading American pianos, such as Steinway, in the early 21st century. Perhaps to an even greater degree, the countries of Latin America have been dependent on immigrants, especially immigrants from countries other than the conquering nations of Spain and Portugal that created these Latin American nations. According to the distinguished French historian Fernand Braudel, It was these immigrants who created modern Brazil, modern Argentina, modern Chile. Among the foreigners who have owned or directed more than half of particular industries in particular countries have been the Lebanese in West Africa, Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, Germans in Brazil, Indians in Fiji, Britons in Argentina, Belgians in Russia, Chinese in Malaysia, and many others. Nor is this all a thing of the past. 4/5 of the donut shops in California are owned by people of Cambodian ancestry. Throughout history, national economic losses from emigration have been as striking as gains from receiving immigrants. After the Moriscos were expelled from Spain in the early 17th century, a Spanish cleric asked, "Who will make our shoes now?" This was a question that might better have been asked before the Moriscos were expelled, especially since this particular cleric had supported the expulsions. Some countries have exported human capital on a large scale. For example, when their educated young people emigrate because other countries offer better opportunities. The Economist reported that more than 60% of the college or university graduates in Fiji, Trinidad, Haiti, Jamaica, and Guyana have gone to live in countries belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. For Guyana, 83% did so. Although it is not easy to quantify human capital, emigration of educated people on this scale represents a serious loss of national wealth. One of the most striking examples of a country's losses due to those who immigrated was that of Nazi Germany, whose anti-Semitic policies led many Jewish scientists to flee to America, where they played a major role in making the United States the first nation with an atomic bomb. Thus, Germany's ally, Japan, then paid an even bigger price for policies that led to massive Jewish emigration from Nazi-dominated Europe. It would be misleading, however, to assess the economic impact of immigration solely in terms of positive contributions. Immigrants have also brought disease, crime, internal strife, and terrorism. Nor can all immigrants be lumped together. When only 2% of immigrants from Japan to the United States go on welfare, while 46% of the immigrants from Laos do so, there is no single pattern that applies to all immigrants. There are similar disparities in crime rates and in other negative and positive factors that immigrants from different countries bring to the United States and to other countries in other parts of the world. Russia and Nigeria are usually ranked among the most corrupt countries in the world, and immigrants from Russia and Nigeria have become notorious for criminal activities in the United States. Everything depends on which immigrants you are talking about, which countries you are talking about, and which periods of history. Imperialism. Plunder of one nation or people by another has been all too common throughout human history. Although imperialism is one of the ways in which wealth can be transferred from one country to another, there are also non-economic reasons for imperialism which have caused it to be persisted in, even when it was costing the conquering country money on net balance. Military leaders may want strategic bases, such as the British base at Gibraltar or the American base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. 19th century missionaries urged the British government toward acquiring control of various countries in Africa, where there was much missionary work going on. Such urgings often being opposed by chancellors of the Exchequer, who realized that Britain would never get enough wealth out of these poor countries to repay the costs of establishing and maintaining colonial regimes there. Some private individuals, like Cecil Rhodes, might get rich in Africa, but the costs to the British taxpayers exceeded even Rhodes's fabulous fortune. Modern European imperialism in general was much more impressive in terms of the size of the territories controlled than in terms of the economic significance of those territories. When European empires were at their zenith in the early 20th century, Western Europe was less than 2% of the world's land area, but it controlled another 40% in overseas empires. However, most major industrial nations sent only trivial percentages of their exports or investments to their conquered colonies in the Third World, and received imports that were similarly trivial compared to what these industrial nations produced themselves or purchased as imports from other industrial countries. Even at the height of the British Empire in the early 20th century, the British invested more in the United States than in all of Asia and Africa put together. Quite simply, there is more wealth to be made from rich countries than from poor countries. For similar reasons, throughout most of the 20th century, the United States invested more in Canada than in all of Asia and Africa put together. Only the rise of prosperous Asian industrial nations in the latter part of the 20th century attracted more American investors to that part of the world. After the world price of oil skyrocketed in the early 21st century, foreign investments poured into the oil-producing countries of the Middle East. As the Wall Street Journal reported, overall, foreign direct investment in the Arab Middle East reached $19 billion last year, 2006, up from $4 billion in 2001. International investment in general continues to go where wealth exists already. Perhaps the strongest evidence against the economic significance of colonies in the modern world is that Germany and Japan lost all their colonies and conquered lands as a result of their defeat in the Second World War, and both countries rebounded to reach unprecedented levels of prosperity thereafter. A need for colonies was a particularly effective political talking point in pre-war Japan, which has had very few natural resources of its own. But after its dreams of military glory ended with its defeat and devastation, Japan simply bought whatever natural resources it needed from those countries that had them, and prospered doing so. Imperialism has often caused much suffering among the conquered peoples. But in the modern industrial world, at least, imperialism has seldom been a major source of international transfers of wealth. While investors have tended to invest in more prosperous nations, making both themselves and these nations wealthier, some people have depicted investments in poor countries as somehow making the latter even poorer. The Marxian concept of exploitation was applied internationally in Lenin's book Imperialism, where investments by industrial nations in non-industrial countries were treated as being economically equivalent to the looting done by earlier imperialist conquerors. Tragically, however, it is in precisely those less developed countries where little or no foreign investment has taken place that poverty is at its worst. Similarly, those poor countries with less international trade as a percentage of their national economies have usually had lower economic growth rates than poor countries where international trade plays a larger economic role. Indeed, during the decades of the 1990s, the former countries had declining economies, while those more globalized countries had growing economies. Wealthy individuals in poor countries often invest in richer countries, where their money is safer from political upheavals and confiscations. Ironically, poorer countries are thus helping richer industrial nations to become still richer. Meanwhile, under the influence of theories of economic imperialism, which depicted international investments as being the equivalent of imperialist looting, governments in many poorer countries pursued policies which discouraged investments from being made there by foreigners. By the late 20th century, however, the painful economic consequences of such policies had become sufficiently apparent to many people in the Third World that some governments, in Latin America and India, for example, began moving away from such policies in order to gain some of the benefits received by other countries which had risen from poverty to prosperity with the help of investments made in their countries by the enterprises in other countries. Economic realities finally broke through ideological visions, though generations had suffered needless deprivation before basic economic facts and principles were finally accepted. Once markets in these countries were opened to foreign goods and foreign investments, both poured in. However small the investments of prosperous countries in poor countries might seem in comparison with their investments in other prosperous countries, those investments have loomed large within the Third World precisely because of the poverty of these countries. As of 1991, foreign companies owned 27% of the businesses in Latin America, and a decade later owned 39%. Many economic fallacies are due to conceiving of economic activity as a zero-sum contest, in which what is gained by one is lost by another. This, in turn, is often due to ignoring the fact that wealth is created in the course of economic activity. If payments to foreign investors impoverished a nation, then the United States would be one of the most impoverished nations in the world because foreigners took $543 billion out of the American economy in 2012, which was more than the gross domestic product of Argentina or Norway. Since most of this money consisted of earnings from assets that foreigners owned in the United States, Americans had already gotten the benefits of the additional wealth that those assets had helped create, and were simply sharing part of that additional wealth with those abroad who had contributed to creating it. A variation on the theme of exploitation is the claim that free international trade increases the inequality between rich and poor nations. Evidence for this conclusion has included statistical data from the World Bank, showing that the ratio of the incomes of the 20 highest income nations to that of the 20 lowest income nations increased from 23 to 1 in 1960 to 36 to 1 by 2000. But such statistics are grossly misleading because neither the top 20 nations nor the bottom 20 nations were the same in 2000 as in 1960. Comparing the same 20 nations in 1960 and 2000 shows that the ratio of the income of the most prosperous nations to that of the most poverty-stricken nations declined from 23 to 1 to less than 10 to 1. Expanded international trade is one of the ways poor nations have risen out of the bottom 20. It is, of course, also possible to obtain foreign technology, machinery, and expertise by paying for these things with export earnings. The poorer a country is, the more that means domestic hardships as the price of economic development. "Let us starve, but export," declared a czarist minister, who was very unlikely to do any starving himself. The very same philosophy was employed later, though not announced, during the era of the Soviet Union, when the industrialization of the economy was heavily dependent on foreign imports, financed by exports of food and other natural resources. According to two Soviet economists writing many years later, during the first 5-year plan, 40% of export earnings came from grain shipments. In 1931, 1/3 of the machinery and equipment imported in the world was purchased by the USSR. Of all the equipment put into operation in Soviet factories during this period, 80 to 85% was purchased from the West. At the time, however, the growth of the state-run Soviet industrial complex was proclaimed a triumph of communism, though in fact it represented an importation of capitalist technology while skimping on food in the Soviet Union. The alternative of allowing foreign investment was not permitted in a government-run economy founded on a rejection of capitalism. Foreign aid. What is called foreign aid are transfers of wealth from foreign governmental organizations, as well as international agencies, to the governments of poorer countries. The term aid assumes a priori that such transfers will in fact aid the poorer countries' economies to develop. In some cases it does, but in other cases foreign aid simply enables the existing politicians in power to enrich themselves through graft and to dispense largesse in politically strategic ways to others who help keep them in power. Because it is a transfer of wealth to governments, as distinguished from investments in private enterprises, foreign aid has encouraged many countries to set up government-run enterprises that have failed, or to create palaces, plazas, or other things meant to impress onlookers, rather than produce things that raise the material standard of living in the recipient country. Perhaps the most famous foreign aid program was the Marshall Plan, which transferred wealth from the United States to various countries in Western Europe after the end of World War II. The Marshall Plan was far more successful than many later attempts to imitate it by sending foreign aid to third world countries. Western Europe's economic distress was caused by the physical devastations of the war. Once the people were fed and the infrastructure rebuilt, Western Europe simply resumed the industrial way of life which they had achieved before. Indeed, which they had pioneered before. That was wholly different from trying to create all the industrial skills that were lacking in poorer, non-industrial nations. What needed to be rebuilt in Europe was physical capital. What needed to be created in much of the Third World was more human capital. The latter proved harder to do, just as the vast array of skills needed in a modern economy had taken centuries to develop in Europe. Even massive and highly visible failures and counterproductive results from foreign aid have not stopped its continuation and expansion. The vast sums of money dispensed by foreign aid agencies, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, give the officials of these agencies enormous influence on the governments of poorer countries, regardless of the success or failure of the programs they suggest or impose as preconditions for receiving money. In short, there is no economic bottom line constraining aid dispensers to determine which actions, policies, organizations, or individuals could survive the weeding out process that takes place through competition in the marketplace. In addition to the foreign aid dispensed by international agencies, there are also direct government-to-government grants of money, shipments of free food, and loans which are made available on terms more lenient than those available on the financial market, and which are from time to time forgiven, allowed to default, or rolled over by being repaid from the proceeds of new and larger loans. Thus, American government loans to the government of India and British government loans to the government of India and British government loans to a number of third world governments have been simply cancelled, converting these loans into gifts. Sometimes a richer country takes over a whole poor society and heavily subsidizes it, as the United States did in Micronesia. So much American aid poured in that many Micronesians abandoned economic activities on which they had supported themselves before, such as fishing and farming. If and when Americans decide to end such aid, it is not at all certain that the skills and experience that Micronesians once had will remain widespread enough in later generations to allow them to become self-sufficient again. Beneficial results of foreign aid are more likely to be publicized by the national or international agencies which finance these ventures, while failures are more likely to be publicized by critics, so the net effect is not immediately obvious. One of the leading development economists of his time, the late Professor Peter Bauer of the London School of Economics, argued that, on the whole, official aid is more likely to retard development than to promote it. Whether that controversial conclusion is accepted or rejected, what is more fundamental is that terms like foreign aid not be allowed to insinuate a result which may or may not turn out to be substantiated by facts and analysis. Another phrase that presupposes an outcome, which may or may not in fact materialize, is the term developing nations, for poorer nations, who may or may not be developing as fast as more prosperous nations, and in a number of cases have actually retrogressed economically over the years. Many third world countries have considerable internal sources of wealth which are not fully utilized for one reason or another, and this wealth often greatly exceeds whatever foreign aid such countries have ever received. In many poorer countries, much, if not most, economic activity takes place off the books, or in the underground economy, because the costs of red tape, corruption, and bureaucratic delays required to obtain legal permission to run a business or own a home put legally recognized economic activities beyond the financial reach of much of the population. These people may operate businesses ranging from street vending to factories or build homes for themselves or others without having any of this economic activity legally recognized by their governments. According to The Economist magazine, in a typical African nation, only about 1 person in 10 works in a legally recognized enterprise or lives in a house that has legally recognized property rights. In Egypt, for example, an estimated 4.7 million homes have been built illegally. In Peru, the total value of all the real estate that is not legally covered by property rights has been estimated as more than a dozen times larger than all the foreign direct investments ever made in the country in its entire history. Similar situations have been found in India, Haiti, and other third world countries. In short, many poor countries have already created substantial amounts of physical wealth that is not legally recognized. and therefore cannot be used to draw upon the financial resources of banks or other lenders and investors, as existing physical wealth can be used to build more wealth-creating enterprises in nations with better functioning property rights systems. The economic consequences of legal bottlenecks in many poor countries can be profound because they prevent many existing enterprises, representing vast amounts of wealth in the aggregate, from developing beyond the small scale in which they start. Many giant American corporations began as very small enterprises, not very different from those which abound in the third world countries today. Founders of Levi's, Macy's, Saks, and Bloomingdale's all began as peddlers, for example. While such businesses may get started with an individual's own small savings, or perhaps with loans from family or friends, eventually their expansion into major corporations usually requires the mobilization of the money of innumerable strangers who are willing to become investors. But the property rights system which makes this possible has not been as accessible to ordinary people in the third world countries as it has been to ordinary people in the United States. An American bank that is unwilling to invest in a small business may nevertheless be willing to lend money to its owner in exchange for a mortgage on his home. But the home must first be legally recognized as the property of the person seeking the loan. After the business becomes a major success, other strangers may then lend money on its growing assets or invest directly as stockholders. But all of this hinges on a system of dependable and accessible property rights, which is capable of mobilizing far more wealth within even a poor country than is ever likely to be transferred from other nations or from international agencies like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Many people judge how much help is being given to poorer countries by either the absolute amount of a donor nation's government transfer of wealth to poorer countries or by the percentage share of that national income that is sent in the form of government-to-government transfers as foreign aid. But an estimated 90% of the wealth transfers to poorer nations from the United States takes the form of private philanthropic donations, business investments, or remittances from citizens from third world countries living in the United States. As of 2010, for example, official development assistance from the United States to third world nations was $31 billion, but American private philanthropy alone sent $39 billion to those nations, while American private capital flows to the third world were $108 billion, and remittances from the United States to those countries were $100 billion. People who measure a donor nation's contributions to poorer countries solely by the amount of official foreign aid sometimes point out that, although foreign aid from the United States is the largest in the world, it is also the smallest as a percentage of Americans' income. But that ignores the vastly larger amount of American transfers of wealth to poor countries in non-governmental forms. Since the beginning of the 21st century, most of the transfers of wealth from prosperous countries in general to poorer countries have been in forms other than what is called foreign aid. A much larger question is the extent to which these international transfers of hundreds of billions of dollars have actually benefited the countries receiving them. That is a much harder question to answer. However, given the differing incentives of those sending wealth in different forms, official foreign aid may have the fewest incentives to ensure that the wealth received will be used to increase output in the recipient country, and thus raise the standard of living of the general population of these nations.